The Horse Race is brought to you by Benchmark Strategies, Boston's leading public affairs and public relations consulting firm. To learn more, connect with Benchmark on LinkedIn at Benchmark Strategies or visit benchmark-strategies.com. Welcome back to The Horse Race, your weekly look at politics, policy, and elections in Massachusetts. I'm Steve Gazella, president of the MassINC Polling Group, here again this week with Rich Parr, vice president of the MassINC Polling Group, and it is Thursday, February 26th. Today we're talking about the State of the Union, and more specifically, the data that comes out of the State of the Union. All right. Here we are again. Rich, welcome back. Good to see you again.
Good to see you, Steve. This was I stayed up and watched this speech last night, the longest State of the Union in history, so I'll be submitting my overtime slips to you for that.
Yeah, that's time and a half, I'm pretty sure. And time and a half also because I think we can safely say we both do about 1.5 times as much work per minute as you would do in any normal polling task, because you've got, the TV going, you've got at least one laptop, maybe two going, at least one phone, probably each with multiple apps and screens going. And it kind of happens like that on election nights, State of the Union, debates, etc. But I should actually ask, Rich, describe your command center, your bridge. You're sitting here watching this thing. What are the various apps that you're looking at? Who are you listening to? Who are you watching? And that sort of thing.
It was a little more subdued than the heydays of years past. You remember when TweetDeck had the multiple columns? You could just drive yourself crazy looking at the scrolling of different feeds and things like that. So I was keeping an eye on social media. But honestly, I tried to really pay attention to the speech because I wanted to see, if there were particular lines or things where he mention Massachusetts? Did he mention, which he did a little bit. Did he, what were the big themes that he was talking about? And I would say at the beginning of the speech, it felt like a conventional speech where you're touting your accomplishments, and then it kind of went a little bit off the rails there and became something a little different. And I thought that was sort of an interesting thing we can talk about.
Yeah, definitely. For me, it actually was also a relatively subdued set of inputs that I had going on. In the lead up to the speech, of course, we all saw lots and lots of polling data come in. Lots of organizations will release a poll just before the State of the Union. The idea being that they want to show how Americans feel about the issues that we all sort of expect the president to talk about. So it might be, in this case, affordability. It might be things like the various military adventures that Trump has taken us on. It might be ICE and things like that. So, those polls we all read kind of in the lead up, but then on the actual night, it was just looking at, the speech itself. And then since then, we've actually also gotten a poll that CNN does every year after the State of the Union, where they ask a set of viewers that they've kind of that they've gotten to sign up ahead of time to take their post State of the Union poll. So we'll have data for that for you as well. So lots of data, but not as many split screens as I've had in the past. But with that as a lead up, should we get into the data?
Yeah, let's do it.
Major political events produce huge trails of data, both leading up to the event and in its aftermath. And Rich and I are going to walk you through some of the numbers, the polls, the takes, some of the big moments in the speech, and so forth. We watched the speech in its entirety, so you don't have to. But if you watched and disagree with our wrap-up or have something to add, as always, we welcome your feedback. So, Rich, you mentioned this is the longest State of the Union in history, and it was edging out the previous longest speech, which was also Donald Trump. Also last year, I think. So I don't know if this is the start of a new trend, but the last couple of years were the longest two States of the Union in history.
Yeah. Well, we're coming out of the Olympics. People like to improve their records with every try. So, he's getting longer and longer. By 2028, maybe we'll be up to 3 hours or something,
Oh,
we'll see where
spare
it goes.
me. Spare me. No, election night's long enough for me. And there, you're actually waiting to see what exactly happened. This, it's a speech that has very specific forms, very specific rituals, and so forth. And I, for one, hope that we can kind of move in the other direction, and maybe some president in the future will be like, I did the whole thing in 26 minutes, and really impress everybody with the concise nature of their delivery.
Yeah.
But I do want to actually start a little bit before the speech with some pre-speech polls, which were pretty remarkable. So, Rich, give us a sense of what some of the polls ahead of time were showing.
Yeah, the polling, there were several polls that came out, as you mentioned, Steve. This is a point where pollsters like to time their polls to come out right before the State of the Union. So you have that baseline, right, that you can see if there's any movement, any bounce afterwards. But the last 5 kind of polls, and these are by big organizations, CNN, Washington Post, ABC, Reuters, had Donald Trump with a net disapproval of 20 or more points. So 20 or more points underwater. In all of these different polls overall. And then when you dig into some of these numbers, you're seeing that, he's doing particularly poorly with independents in the CNN poll, 26% favorable, 73% unfavorable with independents in the CNN poll. That is a staggering number for any political figure. The Washington Post Ipsos poll had him at 39-60 overall, but if you look at kind of 2 of his core issues, the issues that you would say maybe got him elected in 2024, immigration and the economy, traditionally all Republicans, and Trump in particular, have had an advantage on these 2 issues, but he is underwater on both of those. So only 40% of the folks surveyed have a favorable view approve of how he's doing on immigration. Only 41% approve of how he's doing on the economy. So these are his strengths, and they are underwater. And that is, I think, part of the reason why he's, so far down below. I mean, the CNN poll had him at 36% approval, which was, I think, about as low as he got in the very end of his first term in office, which was, of course, January 6th. So we're kind of at that level of unpopularity with this president going into this speech.
Yeah, and the great Elliot Morris over at Strength in Numbers pointed out that he actually doesn't have any positive issues left, where his net approval rating, in other words, the percent who view him, who approve of him minus the percent who disapprove, is still positive. So there's no issue where more people have a positive view of how Trump is doing than have a negative view. The last one was actually border security, but as is pointed out on the website, Strength in Numbers, his one remaining bright spot dropped from a net +4 to 0 over the last month, and he's now underwater or even on every issue we test. So certainly not where you'd want to be going into the speech, and left him a lot of work to do on some of these issues. I think it's also worth pointing out that, we pitch it like that or we pose it like that because that's kind of a conventional way of describing what a State of the Union is typically supposed to do, where you're trying to hit specific issues, you're trying to hit specific policies and so forth. I mean, in a lot of ways, actually, the speech wasn't very conventional and didn't really try to do work on a specific thing or change voters' minds in a specific way.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think the most conventional part was the beginning, where he was trying to sort of lay out that he engaged in this turnaround in the economy. He talked about the golden age of America beginning. He talked about America is winning again. And I don't think that kind of language was, super convincing, but, he kind of laid out a series of, very, very carefully selected economic statistics, showing that prices on certain items had gone down since he had, come into the economy. Fact checkers have had a field day on that section of the speech, I should say. You can go on NPR, you can go on CNN. There's everyone's taken the transcript of the speech and, picked out, where he's misstating certain things and how. But that was the most conventional part. And then I think what was interesting about this speech, Steve, is you mentioned that there are these sort of things that we've come to expect in a State of the Union, where the president's party is standing and cheering for everything, and the opposition party basically sits stone-faced. Everyone has special guests in the gallery that are called upon at different points in the speech in reference to. I would say that this speech leaned into those in just almost in a perverse kind of way. Like, it really took it to another level in a different in a different tone than I've seen in a State of the Union speech, and in a very Donald Trump kind of way, the way that he approached using those different parts of his speech over the course of the night.
And give us a couple examples. What are you thinking of when you say that?
Yeah, so for the most part, the Democrats I think made a very calculated decision to not engage with Trump, with some exceptions. There were a lot of Democrats who didn't come to the speech at all. Several of them went and had a separate rally outside of the Capitol building and just said that they weren't going to attend the speech at all. But of the ones who were there, most of them really sat stone-faced the entire time. And there were some points where you could see that Donald Trump was trying to box them in. By proposing things or that he thought would be extremely popular, getting all of the Republicans to clap and cheer, and then turning to the Democrats and saying, you can't even clap or cheer for that. There were some notable exceptions. Representative Al Green was ejected early in the speech for holding up a sign that said that essentially I forget the exact words of it, but black people are not apes, in reference to the racist meme that Donald Trump had put out that depicted Barack and Michelle Obama as primates, basically a couple of weeks ago. And Al Green had been ejected from last year's State of the Union as well. But for the most part, the Democrats were pretty subdued, and I'm not sure if the optics of that really worked for them on television so well, because Trump was able to sort of turn that around on them a little bit at a couple of points, and I just don't know. It's sort of this classic question: do you fight or do you sort of hold back? And I'm just not sure how well that worked for them in that instance.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, in a way, the State of the Union has so many rituals around it that trying anything new or doing anything unexpected is pretty hard. And the president kind of knows what the format is going to be and has the advantage because, of course, he's the one that's up front. He's the one that's calling the shots. He's the one that kind of decides what's going to be said and what the rhythm of the night is going to be like. So, there's I think an open question as to whether not going is the right thing or for Democrats to do, or sitting on their hands, or if they should have, been more confrontational or should have been more willing to stand up and cheer at different points. I've certainly seen all sides of that issue argued on social media. In terms of the guest thing, though, going back for a minute to the kind of the cameo thing that you mentioned, there was the men's hockey thing. There were also a couple others that I think are worth mentioning. So, Rich, did any others really stick out to you as far as the people or situations that Trump kind of called out throughout his speech?
Yeah, I'd actually be interested to get your take too on this, Steve, as somebody who served. But there were several different service members who were featured, people who had been injured in combat or veterans of past wars. Some of them were quite old, some of them very recently happening. I think one was the helicopter pilot who had gone on this mission to kidnap Maduro from Venezuela. And it wasn't just that Donald Trump was thanking them for their service or talking about their story, but he would go on kind of a long, very detailed at times description of what had happened to this person. And then there would be another service member standing at the ready to literally put a medal on that person in the gallery. Which I could be wrong because I haven't seen every single State of the Union, but I can't recall that happening in that same way such a partisan political environment as that to be giving a medal to somebody in that context. That struck me as very unusual. And also just sort of the very lurid descriptions of some of these things that some of these service people had gone through in order to get these medals was I think a little bit unusual. So I don't know if you had a similar reaction to that watching it, what you thought of those particular moments in the speech.
Yeah, I mean, certainly recognizing service members at the State of the Union is not a new thing. That happens all the time, but it is usually just a shout out or a call out and maybe a brief description of what happened, and everybody thanks the person, and it's this big bipartisan moment and so forth. So I think that happens a lot. It did feel a little weird. The medal thing feels a little bit weird, and I think it's because of the partisan environment. In a way, I would like to be able to think, to take the opposite point of view that, if there's a big national celebration that's celebrating some service member's extraordinary accomplishments, makes perfect sense. But when you see the partisan, clown show that the State of the Union has devolved to, it's hard to think that that's the right environment to present a medal of that kind. So that part I didn't particularly care for, but certainly shouting out service members, they've done, the people he called out certainly have done some extraordinary things. So that part, happens on both sides, and no problem with that at all.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I mean, again, it's not that these are completely unprecedented things. It's just the Trump spin on it is, I think, a little different than we've seen in previous States of the Union speeches.
Yeah, definitely. All right, so we have more data. One piece of data, actually, just as an aside, that we do not have yet is viewership. And that's because although you may know by the time you listen to this podcast what viewership was, we don't know because it doesn't come out until Thursday. And we are actually recording this at about 1:30 on Wednesday. So what to look for basically is you're looking for numbers somewhere kind of in the 40 million-ish range. If it's down in the 30s or even the 20s, that's low. If it's above 50, that's super high. So just keep those numbers in mind as you're looking for viewership numbers. Numbers we do have, though, are the post-election poll, which is something CNN has been doing for several decades now, where, as I kind of alluded to in the intro, they basically recruit a group of people who are going to watch the speech and then respond to it. And one quick caveat on that is that the group that they recruit is always slanted toward the president's party. And the reason for that isn't because they're trying to juice the numbers. It's just because that's who watches the speech. If it's a Democrat in office, more Democrats watch it. If it's a Republican in office, more Republicans tune in. Either party wants to hear their party winning. They want to hear their person. They want to hear their policies. And some people from the other side will watch it, hate watch it because they're doing their civic duty, whatever it is. But just it affects the numbers. And we'll explain that in a second. So, Rich, the CNN poll, what is kind of the top line on what the poll actually found?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, they did note that this sample is about 13 points more Republican than you would expect if you were doing a traditional representative sample of everybody in the country. So with that caveat, what they found is about two-thirds of the folks who watched the speech came away with a positive impression of it. But only 38% had a very positive impression, and that's about 6 points lower than what we saw last year with Trump's last State of the Union speech. So his numbers are down slightly off of that. And this is, again, amongst a sort of favorable or friendly crowd. And if you compare those numbers to previous presidents, Biden, Obama, Bush, etc., looking at their midterm year, right? So this is the second year of their first term where they're up against the midterm election in November. We're seeing that this very positive number is considerably lower than all of those other previous presidents as well. So definitely, I think indicative of where Trump is starting from a little bit, and some of the challenges of bringing people back, but also maybe something about the length of the speech or sort of the tone of the speech at times veering into sort of very, very partisan nature turned some people off. It just didn't have as much of an effect as even his speech last year did.
Yeah, and as you noted at the beginning with some of the pre-speech approval numbers, his image is very bad right now. Like, there's no kind of other way to spin it compared to past presidents, compared to his own past. Like, his favorables are bad, his approval numbers are bad. So I think some of that probably is rubbing off in the speech as well. And that left him basically with much lower numbers than Obama or Biden or even himself in the past, or Bush. So just offering a couple points of comparison, 38% said very positive in terms of how their reaction was to the speech this year for Donald Trump. In his first term, that same number was between 48 and 59%. For Biden, it was between 34 and 51%. So actually, he was kind of in similar territory to where Biden was on very positive. But Biden also had a little bit more sort of soft approval. And then you go further back and you see, what did it used to be like? And you see lots of people having very positive reviews for Barack Obama and George W. Bush, Bill Clinton. You'd often have 80, not even 90% holding positive views of what they heard in those speeches. So I think in a way it's a sign of the way politics has changed, that 60 something percent positive, it sounds like a good number, where in the past, like, you'd be looking for much higher numbers than that and would often get them, for presidents like Obama or either of the Bushes. That, of course, was not the only number that poll included. So, Rich, what other numbers stuck out to you from that CNN post-speech poll?
I think one of the other questions I thought was very interesting to look at was they asked respondents, do you think the policies that Donald Trump has proposed will move the country in the right direction or the wrong direction? And prior to this speech, with this same group of respondents, 54% said in the right direction and 45% the wrong direction. That's pretty evenly split here. It does improve after the speech, so 64% say the right direction and 36% say the wrong direction. But again, this is an audience that is like self-selected to be watching this speech and to be a little bit more Republican, and you're still getting a little more than a third of them thinking that what they just heard in this speech is not going to be taking people, not going to be taking the country in the right direction. And again, those numbers are much more divided and much more, I would say, tilted towards the negative direction than if you were to compare them to even Donald Trump's first term or to prior presidents as well. So in general, I think it just sort of speaks to the hole that Trump is in right now, and the fact that he did a little bit of help to get himself out of it. There is definitely an improvement going from 54 to 64 and having that wrong go down, but it's not the sort of numbers that we were seeing on some of these other speeches.
Yeah, it's actually the lowest number in 30 years. 30 years of CNN polling, there's never been as anything less than anything down at that level, which was 62%. So Obama's lowest was 68%. George W. Bush's lowest number was 67%. Bill Clinton's lowest number that they measured, which they didn't go all the way back to the beginning, was actually 83%. So again, you see these numbers up in the 80s and 90s, like 2002, George W. Bush, right after 9/11, 91% said that they thought that what they just heard from George W. Bush would move the country in the right direction. 2009, so you're thinking Barack Obama's first term, 88%. And now we're down to 62%. So, it's a majority, but it's a majority of a very right-leaning audience and certainly not the number you'd be looking for. Okay, and then we should look at whether people liked the priorities that they heard about. So the question there was, so far, would you say Donald Trump has had the right priorities or hasn't paid enough attention to the country's most pressing problems? There, 54% said that they thought he had the right priorities, down from 59% in his last speech, and kind of in a similar range to what he'd gotten in the 2017 and 18 range. So that one, actually, there's not quite as much of a difference as there are in some of the other questions.
I think that what's really striking on that one is, so we have the pre-speech and the post-speech numbers for each of these questions, because they do this twice. They kind of identify people and do a pre-survey with them, and then they come back to them after the speech. That's how they're able to turn it around so quickly. And the numbers on this for the pre-speech are really striking. 44% has the right priorities. 56% hasn't paid enough attention to the country's most important problems. So he was able to flip that back into the positive, if you will. But the fact that he was starting underwater there, I think, is very consistent with the other polls that we discussed at the beginning of the podcast today, where it was just showing the hole that he's in. And that is different also than the pre-speech numbers that he had a year ago. Pre-speech numbers a year ago, he had 56% right priority, 42% hasn't paid enough attention to the most important problems. And then after that speech, there was very little movement. It went up to 59, has the right priorities, 41. So he really didn't move the needle very much on that one. At least in this speech, he did actually manage to convince the people who tuned in that he was looking at the right things, which was not the case going into the speech.
And there's just then one more set of numbers that I want to touch on, there were three questions about whether or not people thought Trump was focusing too much or too little on different things. And the three things that they mentioned were the economy, immigration, and then foreign policy. And for each one, they just asked that question, whether the amount of focus was too much, the right amount, or too little. The thing that stuck out to me there right off the bat was that 45% of this, again, very Republican-leaning audience, said that they thought Trump is focusing too little on the economy and cost of living, and 38% said too much on immigration. So more, just to be clear, said the right amount. But again, those are really high numbers for what should be a very friendly audience for Trump.
Yeah, and it's interesting how he talked about immigration in this speech, too. He didn't talk about ICE. He didn't talk about Minnesota. He didn't really try to defend or put a positive spin on any of that. That really was not present in the speech as far as that I can recall. He talked a lot about immigrants and said some pretty nasty and divisive things about them, and spent a lot of time describing horrific crimes that he said had been committed by immigrants or by people that Democrats had let out of prison or things like that in very lurid detail. But he really did not. If you had watched this speech without the context of knowing what was going on in Minnesota, it was completely absent from it. So I think the people who wrote this speech kind of understood how much of a liability that is for him right now, and that's definitely coming through in these numbers.
Yeah, for sure. All right, so then taking it all together, wrapping it all up, Rich, what is your main takeaway from this? Did Donald Trump do what he needed to do, what he was trying to do? Does this change anything?
I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if he gets a little bit of a bounce simply because he seems to be at a very, very, very much of a nadir for him in opinion. It's hard to go further down. So, but is that going to get him back into positive territory? I don't think so, because he's so far down to start with. I think what we're seeing here with these post speech polls is just everyone knows who Donald Trump is. He's been around for such a long time. Even his supporters, I think, have the things about him that they like and that they don't like. And he's able to remind them of some of the things that they like about him to some extent. But that there is this very difficult hole that he's dug himself into, and I would be surprised if we saw a miraculous turnaround here. But I wouldn't be surprised if we saw a slight improvement the next time we see his approval numbers come out.
Yeah, and I actually would guess that they're going to stay the same, so I guess we'll have to wait and see. I mean, I think that for pretty much the same reasons that everybody knows him so well and knows all the policies so well and has seen this show so many times, and kind of been through it so many times that it probably won't change that much, but there's no way to know it except for waiting. Actually, there is one other bit of data that I do want to touch on, which came in kind of as we were just in the final minutes of preparing for this, which was a set of dial groups. And what those are basically are people watch the speech and they have a dial in their hand, which goes from 0 to 100, with 100 being positive, 0 being the worst possible. And as they're listening to the speech, they either spin it positively if they like what they're hearing, or they spin it negatively if they don't like what they're hearing. And part of the reason that I feel like he's been around for so long that stuff can't really change or won't really change that much is when he did some of his like really old stuff about like, you're going to get tired of winning. People are going to say we can't stand winning so much. Like the dials just went straight down into the dumps, and that just makes me think like the act is so old now that I just wonder how much persuasive power it still has.
I noticed that too. And I also noticed that in that dial report, and we should say that this was done for a group called Navigator Research, which is like sort of a democratic messaging type of project, but done by a very good demo-line pollster, Margie O'Mara, that the parts of the speech where he did talk about other people, when he was talking about the war veterans, when he was talking about the servicemen, people liked that better. So when he gets out of his own Trump self, with all of his tics and grievances and the things that he's so used to saying, that did better for him. And I wonder if that was a calculated move on their part. Again, I didn't like it personally. It felt a little exploitative to me, but it did seem to react better with these dial crowds to kind of take it out of Trump and bring it to talking about other people, and bringing those into the conversation.
All right. Well, will the numbers go up? Will they stay the same? We'll see in a couple weeks. For now, we'll be right back.
I'm Zainab Asma-Doyle, Research Director at the MassINC Polling Group. The MassINC Polling Group serves the region's leading foundations, political groups, government entities, and businesses. Our surveys and focus groups bring high-quality data to the toughest questions facing society today. Learn more at massincpolling.com.
And that brings us to our final segment, which this week is brought to you by our unbelievable rankings department here at Horse Race Global Media Empire headquarters. And that is because there was an amazing, deeply scientific study released this week from, it's called Ticket Source, I think, which I'm assuming is one of these predatory ticket sites, which has, against all odds, identified Boston as the funniest city in America. Rich, it's the funniest city in America. It says so right here in the study.
Yeah, I guess they're basing this on, let's see, a mix of strong ticket demand, local comedians, and a high concentration of comedy venues per capita. So I guess that makes us the funniest if you're going by those metrics here. And, it's subjective, but yeah, we do have, I'd say we punch above our weight if you think about it. You got your Amy Poehler's, your Seth Meyers. I think Jimmy Fallon's technically from New York, but I feel like he's adopted Massachusetts. Adam Sandler,
yeah, Conan O'Brien,
close enough. Conan O'Brien, yeah, we have a good. I'll take that one. I'll take it. We can be the funniest city.
I think it's more that like our daily affect isn't funny. Like you don't walk down the street of Boston and think, boy, this is just a laugh riot. Just jokes everywhere. Everybody just having a good time. Like, dancing and singing in the streets like that. That's not the image of Boston that comes to mind when I think of it.
Yeah, well, it could be a laughing at us versus laughing with us situation.
The funniest looking city.
Yeah, or like the whole Duncan Masshole shtick. Speaking of which, did you hear that Dunkin' Donuts is testing 48-ounce buckets of iced coffee? And one of the test locations is at UMass Amherst. So I think I'm going to have to follow up my overtime expenses for the State of the Union with a expense report where I go to try these out for the next week for the podcast.
What are they testing them as? Like for drinking or for like weapons or like drowning people in, or like what are they actually for?
It almost looks like a pail from a sandbox with a strap on it, and it's filled with iced coffee.
Amazing. Yeah. It's like a cattle trough of cold brew. That'll be their next product idea. I should note that also on this list we had, number 1 was Boston. Number 2 is Washington, D.C. Again, you don't think like laugh riot when you think of Washington, but what do I know? San Francisco and Atlanta tied for number 3. Orlando, St. Louis, Seattle, Miami, Minneapolis, and Chicago. So those are your top 10 funniest cities in America, according to this deeply scientific study that we can definitely stand behind.
New York doesn't even make the list. That's fascinating.
Poor New York. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have for today. I'm Steve Cazella, signing off with Rich Parr. Our production and theme music is done by Charlie Cazella. You can write to us with your best comedy bit at thehorseracepodcast@gmail.com. Don't forget to give The Horse Race a review wherever you're hearing us now. Subscribe to Commonwealth Beacon's daily download, and reach out to us here at the MassINC Polling Group if you need polls or focus groups done. For now, thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next week.